One morning, everything seemed normal. It was just another day. Got in my car, started it up, and headed to work like I always do. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. It wasn't until I noticed that I had parked in a spot the night before that seemed a little too far from my usual space. It was a small thing, so I brushed it off. But then, a couple of days later, the same thing happened again. I'd swear I hadn't parked there, yet somehow, my car was always ending up in the same exact spot. It felt weird, like someone was following me. I kept thinking, am I just being paranoid, or is something actually going on? The thought lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I kept telling myself, it's just coincidence. Maybe I'm parking in the wrong spots without noticing. But then came the day I almost ran into another car in my own neighborhood, an area I've lived in for years without any problems. I didn't recognize the car, but it was there, just sitting in a spot I never remembered seeing it. My heart raced for a second, and I swear, that's when it hit me. There was something strange going on. Was someone keeping tabs on me? But who? That was the big question, and honestly, I wasn't prepared for the answer I would soon find out. I had never been the type of person to jump to conclusions, but everything felt off. It wasn't just that one morning I found myself parking in a spot I didn't remember parking in the night before. No, it was a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. For the past few days, I'd been noticing strange things about my car. It wasn't just where it was parked, though that was part of it. It was more the feeling, the way it felt like I was being watched, like my every move was being followed. And at first, I shrugged it off. I thought, maybe I was just being paranoid. It happens, right? You start noticing things and your mind plays tricks on you. But then, after it happened again and again, something in me clicked. This wasn't just paranoia. There was something happening, something I couldn't explain. My gut was screaming at me that I was being followed, and I couldn't ignore that feeling any longer. One day, I was heading out to run some errands when I noticed it. The tiny glint of metal underneath my car. It was almost hidden, tucked under the bumper, but there it was. At first, I thought it was just a piece of debris, but then I took a closer look. My heart skipped a beat. It was too clean, too well placed to be a random piece of junk. I crouched down, feeling my hands go clammy. I reached down slowly, unsure of what I might find, but somehow knowing it wasn't going to be good. I pulled out the object, and there it was, a small black device. It looked like a GPS tracker, one of those small ones you read about, the ones that can be used to track someone's movements without them ever knowing. My mind started to race as I turned the device over in my hand. I wasn't imagining things, was I? This thing had been placed there deliberately, with purpose. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been tracking my car. Someone had been following me. It wasn't just some random coincidence. Someone had been watching my every move, and I had no idea who or why. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I stood there, holding the tracker in my hand. I didn't even know what to do with it. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, my mind spinning. Was this some kind of prank? But who would go to such lengths to mess with me? I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this slide. I had to know who was behind this. I couldn't just ignore it, not when I had concrete proof that someone had been tracking me. I tried to think rationally, tried to process the situation, but the more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. How long had this been going on? How many times had I been followed without even realizing it? The worst part? I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random person. No, this had to be someone I knew, someone who had access to my neighborhood, someone who knew where I lived and where I went. That thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't dwell on it for too long. I had to act. I couldn't just keep this to myself. The moment I realized what had been going on, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. So, I took the tracker, held it tightly in my hand, and headed straight to the police. I didn't know what kind of response I was going to get, but I knew I had to try. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in, and I felt this sense of urgency pushing me forward. When I walked into the police station, I tried to stay calm, but inside I was panicking. What if they didn't take me seriously? What if they thought I was overreacting? What if they laughed it off and told me to forget about it? My hands were still shaking as I handed the tracker over to the officer. He took a look at it, then glanced up at me. For a second, he didn't say anything. I could feel my anxiety rising as the seconds ticked by, but then the officer looked back at the tracker, his face suddenly more serious. "This is definitely not something we take lightly," he said, his voice cold and firm. "Someone's been following you, and that's not okay." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time, the dread that had been gnawing at me started to come back. They weren't just going to brush this off. This was real. Someone had been tracking me, and they were serious about it. The officer told me they'd need to investigate further, that they'd run tests on the tracker to see if they could trace its origin. But even as I nodded and agreed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the officer made a call to his colleagues, I stood there in the station, still in shock. I had just uncovered something I couldn't ignore, and as the officer spoke in low tones, making arrangements for the next steps, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger than that. Someone was out there watching me, and they weren't just going to let this go. I didn't know who they were, but I was about to find out. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that gripped me the moment I left the police station. The officer had assured me that they would investigate, but the weight of the situation was still heavy on my chest. Someone had been tracking my every move, and as much as I wanted to believe that this would be solved quickly deep down, I knew better. This wasn't going to be simple. It never was. But what really sent a chill down my spine was the possibility that whoever was behind this tracker knew more about me than I realized. They might have been watching me for weeks, maybe months. Who knows how far back this goes? And just how much did they know? I couldn't get those thoughts out of my head. I spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance, hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every car that pulled up next to me felt suspicious. Every person who glanced in my direction felt like a potential threat. I even started checking my car each time I parked it, running my hands along the underside of the vehicle just to make sure nothing else had been planted there. I couldn't let my guard down. But then, the phone call came. The officer had some news for me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a glimmer of hope. They'd traced the tracker's signal to a specific location. The relief I felt at hearing those words was almost overwhelming. Finally, some answers. I wasn't just being paranoid. There was something to this. The officer told me they'd be sending someone to the location, but they needed my cooperation. They asked me to come down to the station again to meet with the detective assigned to my case. When I arrived, the detective was already waiting for me. He had a serious look on his face, one that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. As soon as I sat down, he got straight to the point. "We've located the source of the tracker," he said, his voice low and measured. "It's coming from a nearby property." I felt a rush of adrenaline flood my system. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. We were getting closer to the truth. The detective told me that the tracker had been sending out signals to a nearby cell tower, pinpointing its location with startling accuracy. And when they checked the data, it led them right to a house just a few blocks away from mine. But there was something strange about that house. It didn't belong to anyone they could find in the system. No one lived there, at least not officially. The house had been abandoned for years. Or so it seemed. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? Why was the tracker coming from an abandoned house? The detective didn't have all the answers yet, but they were starting to make some calls. He asked if I had any connections to the house, but I couldn't think of a single reason why it would be connected to me. Then he dropped another bombshell. "There's a neighbor across the street from the house," he said, looking at me closely. "And they've been reporting some strange activity over the last few months. People coming and going at odd hours. Nothing on the books, but enough to raise suspicion." My heart began to race again. Could it be? Was someone I knew involved in this? Had someone been watching me from this house, hiding in plain sight? The detective seemed to sense my growing anxiety. "We'll need you to come with us," he said, standing up. "We're going to pay a visit to this property, and we need to do it quietly. We don't want to tip them off that we're onto them." I nodded without thinking. I didn't have to be told twice. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment I would finally get some answers. As we approached the location, the air seemed to thicken, the silence in the car almost suffocating. The abandoned house loomed ahead, its windows dark and uninviting. The detective drove slowly, his eyes scanning the area, looking for anything that might seem out of place. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. We parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way. The closer we got to the house, the more I could feel my heart beating faster, each step bringing us closer to the unknown. I kept thinking, what if we're walking into a trap? What if we're walking right into the hands of whoever's been watching me? But there was no turning back now. We had to find out what was going on. As we approached the house, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It wasn't just the overgrown weeds in the yard or the peeling paint on the walls. It was something more, something hidden just beneath the surface. We crept around to the back of the house, where the detective said he had seen signs of recent activity. I could feel the tension building as we neared the door. The air was thick with anticipation. What would we find? Would we finally uncover who was behind the tracker? As the detective reached for the door handle, I froze. I thought I heard a noise, someone inside the house, shuffling around. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I wondered if we were about to face something far worse than I had imagined. Before I could say anything, the detective motioned for me to stay quiet. He slowly pushed open the door and we stepped inside, our footsteps muffled by the creaky wooden floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from a few cracks in the boarded-up windows. As we moved through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence was deafening, and every small sound seemed amplified. We had to be careful. One wrong move, and we could alert whoever was hiding in there. And then, just as I was about to ask the detective what he thought we'd find, I heard something. A soft click. It came from upstairs. I froze, and so did the detective. The air seemed to still. We both turned to look at the stairs, our eyes locked in mutual understanding. Whatever was up there, we were about to find out. The police were taking the situation seriously now. After all the phone calls and the back and forth with the authorities, things were moving. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that the end was near, I still felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I had gotten the initial confirmation. The tracker was real and the authorities had located it, but there was still so much that wasn't clear. The police had gone as far as tracing the signals from the tracker, but it wasn't over yet. The detective had been incredibly professional, calm under pressure, and kept reassuring me that everything was in place. But I knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. No, this was a labyrinth I was now deep inside of, and I had no idea how many twists and turns it would take before it ended. A few days passed, and each time I thought about the tracker, about the house, my mind raced with 1,000 questions. It wasn't just about the person who put the tracker on my car anymore. It was about the reason behind it. Was I being watched for something more than just petty drama? Did someone want something from me? What was it about that house? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The detective had promised me an update, and I had been on edge, waiting for any scrap of information that might reveal the full truth. And then the call came. It was early morning, and I had just made myself a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. The detective was on the other end, and from the tone of his voice, I knew things were about to take a turn. "We've got something," he said. My heart leapt into my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight. "What's going on?" "We've got a name." The tracker's signal came back to a nearby property, a house that, on paper, has no owner, the one we mentioned before. My pulse quickened. He went on, explaining that the house was connected to an address that led them to an individual whose name was tied to the property through an obscure legal loophole. And this person had some kind of history with the neighborhood. The detective didn't go into specifics just yet, but from the way he said it, I could tell they were piecing something together. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for, but it was still a long road ahead. The person behind this was smart. Whoever it was had covered their tracks well. The detective suggested that I stay calm, and he assured me that they were closing in on this person. But how long could it really take to find out who was behind all of this? The feeling of being watched had only intensified over the past few days, and the idea that someone had been following me for so long made my skin crawl. I wondered if I had brushed past this person without even realizing it. Was there someone close to me, someone I knew, who had a hand in all this? The questions were swirling in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Still, I had to focus on the next steps. I couldn't let myself get overwhelmed. The detective had promised to keep me updated, and I had to trust that the investigation was in good hands. I spent the next few days trying to stay busy, keeping my routine the same, but it was nearly impossible to concentrate on anything else. Every little sound, every person who walked by, felt like a potential threat. I couldn't escape the constant fear that the person who had been tracking me was closer than I realized. At night, I kept the blinds shut tight, not because I felt like anyone was watching me, but because I was desperate to protect the illusion of safety. I needed to feel like I had control, even though I knew that control was slipping further and further from my grasp. The detective called again a few days later, and this time, his news was both exciting and terrifying. The individual tied to the abandoned house had been identified. And shockingly, they weren't a stranger after all. The name that came up was someone I recognized, someone from my past, someone I had never thought twice about. It was a neighbor from a few houses down the street, someone who had always seemed a little off, but nothing too alarming. We'd never been close, just casual greetings when we crossed paths in the yard. They had lived in the neighborhood for years, always keeping to themselves. But now, that person was the key to everything. I couldn't believe it. The person I had been living next to, the one I had never really thought about, had been spying on me for months, maybe even longer. It didn't make sense. Why would they target me? The detective told me that the house they were tied to had been abandoned for years, but the neighbor had been using it as a sort of base of operations. They had been monitoring people, gathering information, maybe even following several of us. It seemed that I wasn't the only one who had been under surveillance. The detective assured me that they were going to take immediate action, but they needed my help to make sure we got all the information we could. I had to stay sharp. I had to help them build the case to make sure they had enough evidence to take this person down. The thought of it all was overwhelming. I kept asking myself, how could I not have known? How could I not have seen this coming? The person who had been watching me was a quiet, unassuming individual, someone who blended in so well with the background that they had practically become invisible. And yet, there they were, pulling the strings, watching my every move. The detective promised that this wasn't over yet, that they would do everything they could to stop this person from continuing their actions. But the knowledge that I had been under constant surveillance for so long was unsettling. What else had this person seen? What had they been doing with the information they gathered? My head was spinning. That's when the detective dropped another bombshell. The neighbor hadn't been working alone. There were others involved, people they were connected to. And that meant this wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was something much bigger than I had ever imagined. Who else was watching? What had they been planning? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The detective gave me some final instructions to make sure I stayed safe while they launched their investigation. It was clear that things were about to escalate, and the situation was far from over. The worst part? I still didn't know what this person's ultimate goal was. Why had they been watching me? What had they wanted from me? And just how far were they willing to go to get it? My mind was racing with possibilities, but I knew that there was only one thing left to do now. Wait. Wait for the police to make their move. Wait for the investigation to unfold. But as I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over yet. The day the police showed up at that eerie, supposedly abandoned house, it didn't feel real. I watched from a distance as they moved in, squad cars blocking the street, unmarked vehicles parked discreetly. Officers in plain clothes surrounded the perimeter while a forensic team prepared to enter. This wasn't just a casual investigation anymore. This was a full-scale operation. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood on the porch, phone in hand, talking to the detective who'd kept me informed since day one. "We're going in," he said calmly, but I could tell even he was tense. "We have a warrant, and your neighbor is about to have the worst day of their life." My eyes drifted toward the house. The broken shutters, the overgrown lawn. It looked like no one had been there for years, but that was the perfect illusion. A cover-up so clean, so calculated, that it had fooled the entire block. Except now, the truth was coming out. And fast. Minutes later, they brought him out. My neighbor. The same quiet guy I'd waved to casually all these years. He looked disheveled but strangely composed, like he'd prepared for this moment. No panic, no resistance, just this eerie calm that made my stomach twist. I couldn't believe it. He had lived among us like nothing was wrong, like he wasn't operating a full-blown surveillance operation out of a so-called ghost house. When the detective finally met me in person that afternoon, the first thing he said was, "You were right to trust your gut." Then he handed me a thick folder. Inside were photos, receipts, diagrams, even journal entries. The man had been tracking not just me, but several families. He had maps with routes people took, times they left their homes, license plates, shopping habits. It was like something straight out of a thriller movie, only it was my actual life. I flipped through the pages in silence, each one a gut punch. And then I stopped on one note scribbled in the margin. Observe her response. She's the key. I blinked at that line again and again. Me? The key to what? That's when the detective explained the real twist. This neighbor wasn't just spying for curiosity. He was hired. Not by a government agency, not even by a criminal organization, but by someone on the HOA board. Yeah, the same HOA that once sent me letters for having my garbage bins out 30 minutes too early. Turns out, they had been investigating residents under the radar, trying to catch violations before they happened so they could slap people with outrageous fines or force them out entirely. Why? So they could resell the homes to their own friends or people willing to pay extra for special privileges. The tracker on my car? That wasn't about safety or curiosity. It was all about power and money. They were trying to prove I was unstable, that I had suspicious behavior, and use that as leverage to hit me with HOA violations I couldn't defend against. I was a target in their little real estate scam, and I wasn't alone. 3 other neighbors were also being watched. One of them had already moved away because they couldn't handle the harassment. Another had filed a lawsuit that mysteriously disappeared. As the truth unraveled, the police raided the HOA office. Computers were seized. Phones were taken in as evidence. Several board members were arrested or forced to resign. The president of the HOA? Gone. Turns out he was the one who funded the tracker operation. And the neighbor they arrested? He was promised a cut of the profits from resold homes. It was disgusting. And yet, it all made sense. Every strange warning letter, every new fine, every creepy glance. I hadn't been paranoid. I had been right all along. The relief hit me like a wave, but it was mixed with rage. Rage that it had gone this far, that no one had listened until now, that people like them thought they could just toy with others' lives like we were pawns on a board. A few weeks later, things started to feel normal again. No more strange cars trailing me. No more cryptic letters from the HOA. My neighbors actually came out to talk now, real conversations, not just forced smiles and quick hellos. We bonded over what we'd all been through, and slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. The abandoned house was officially boarded up, marked for demolition. But even as they nailed the board shut, I couldn't help but feel like something still lingered in the air. A reminder that power unchecked becomes dangerous, that silence enables cruelty, and that sometimes you have to fight back even when people think you're crazy, because being crazy might just mean you're the only one who sees the truth. And if you made it this far, you now know the truth behind how deep these kinds of manipulations can go. How people will twist rules, invade privacy, and abuse power just to control what isn't theirs. If this story shook you, made you question how things work in your neighborhood, or even just made you double-check your rearview mirror, then you're exactly the kind of person we want with us. Real stories like this don't get told enough. But here, we uncover them. Here, we stand up. So if you're done being silenced, if you believe in shining a light on the things that happen behind closed doors, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just entertainment, it's exposure. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.